So at the very beginning of this chapter, we get into the most controversial part about this chapter. This is the chapter that a lot of people use to try to say that we need to obey the government no matter what. And so let's just read the Bible for what it says and read exactly what it says. And we'll see what it doesn't say as well. So notice there in verse 1, it says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation." Notice what it says. It says the power, the power, the powers. Now what this is talking about is that government, the power of government, is ordained of God. And that's what this is talking about, is the fact that God has ordained government and has ordained, basically for, and we'll see exactly what it's for. He hasn't ordained government to tell you what you should eat and what you should drink and what you should, where you should work, what all this stuff. That's what they want you to think that the government's saying. But he specifically tells us what the government's power is. But what this is talking about is the higher powers. What's interesting is all the new versions change this. All the new versions. And I actually was looking up and I was just curious if the New King James, everybody's like, oh, the New King James is really close to the King James. Well, it says exactly, in the New King James, it says the exact same thing it does in all the other versions. So in the New King James, it says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities." So now, instead of it being subject unto the higher power, and here's the thing, who's the highest power? God. So now it's not saying, be subject unto the higher powers. It's just saying be subject unto the governing authorities, period. Okay, so governing authorities. "For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." So it goes on, and instead of using power, it says authorities. And so it's basically saying individuals. God has ordained individuals. Okay, now definitely there are cases where God does ordain individuals, but notice it doesn't say that he's ordaining individual people here. He's ordaining the powers that be, the power itself. Does that make sense? And we'll get into that as far as what that even means, to ordain the power itself. So there's a false doctrine out there, and we'll get into that, about how God, every leader in the world, God has appointed and ordained. Now first cut, you should say, that sounds retarded. Because think of Joseph Stalin, who killed, 8 million of his own people? And so, and it may even be more than that, but millions of his own people. Do you think God ordained him as the person, or appointed him? And so we'll get into that in the Bible. But this passage really reminds me of what was going on between Pilate and Jesus. Okay? Because if you say that God ordains, all the governing officials, that means that basically what they do is right all the time. Does that make sense? That you'd have to say that God's ordaining politicians that are ripping people off, politicians that are doing wickedness, and so obviously he's not ordaining the physical persons in this aspect. Now there are people that he appointed, like King Saul and King David. We'll get into that. But in this case, he's just talking in general. He's saying the higher powers. And so obviously, what's the number one highest power that we have? God. His Word. So that should be number one that we look to as far as the number one authority. And anything that goes against that is garbage. I mean, if it goes against the Bible, obviously you're supposed to look at the higher power. So every other version, though, they take out the higher powers. They take out that structure of like God, and going down the line as far as the highest power. And so in John chapter 19, though, this is, when I read this is what I kind of think about, is this conversation that Pilate and Jesus had before Jesus is crucified. So John chapter 19 and verse 10. So obviously this is when they're wanting to crucify Jesus, and Pilate's talking to him. And in verse 9, he doesn't answer him, and Pilate is kind of shocked by that, or taken back by that. And notice in verse 10 it says, Then saith Pilate unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee and have power to release thee? So notice, Pontius Pilate is the governor that's over Jerusalem, right? And so we know that the Romans are taking over, and the Jews couldn't put anybody to death by the Roman law. They had to have the Romans do it. That's why the Romans ended up technically killing Jesus, like crucifying him the Roman way, because the Jews, by their law, couldn't put anybody to death. It even says that in John chapter 19, that, that they can't put them to death by the law. And so they say, we have a law that he should die, but we can't do it because of the Roman law. And so in verse 11 it says, Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me except it were given thee from above. So notice the higher powers. Remember, God has given power unto Pilate in order to govern. And so the only reason he even has power as an authority is because God has allowed him to have it. Now, but notice what he says here. He says, Therefore, he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. Now, the only way that this can make sense is to say that Pilate is going to be sinning by condemning him. Does that make sense? And so what he's saying is that, yes, the Jews have a greater sin. But if, he knows, obviously, Jesus knows that Pilate's going to allow this to happen. But Pilate sins. As the authority, he sins in allowing a just man be put to death. Does that make sense? So this authority, this Roman authority, is not doing justice. He's not being a legitimate ruler, which we'll talk about here in a second, or here in a minute. But this is a good application here that governments can sin, and therefore that's not ordained by God. God didn't ordain Pilate and say, kill Jesus, okay? Obviously, he came unto his own received him not. Now, God knew that's what was going to happen, but that's not what he told them to do, you know what I mean? So, but God sets, he does set up rulers and he brings down rulers. But God does not set up every single person that's ever been in office, that's ever been in a position of power, that's ever been a king, a ruler, a governor. And to say that is ludicrous. Okay, and it's not scriptural either. And so that's what they take with Romans 13 and say, well, everybody that's ever in a position of power or in a governing authority, God has put his stamp of approval on that. That's hogwash. That's just not Bible. But Acts 13, go to Acts 13. And I want to give you the with Saul and David. Okay? So God chose Saul, but then he removed Saul and put David in his place. Now here's a case where he does set up kings and remove kings. Okay? So I want to show you that he does do that. And so I'm not saying he never ordains a king, but there's always a condition on that. Saul didn't have this ordaining where whatever he does, God's for it. Does that make sense? Like, he had a rule, and if he didn't follow God's commandments, then he would not be king anymore. Remember, he refused and he rejected Saul from being king. And so we're going to get into that as far as when we get further in here. But I want to lead up to this to show you, hey, he does remove and set up kings, but there are others that he doesn't. So in Acts chapter 13, verse 21, it says, And afterward they desired a king, and God gave unto them Saul, the son of Cis, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, by the space of 40 years. In verse 22 it says, And when he had removed him, he raised up unto them David to be their king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, which shall fulfill all my will. So he removes Saul and sets up David. Because Saul didn't keep his commandments, didn't do what he was supposed to do, therefore he rejected him from being king. Now, when did he reject him from being king? You remember when Samuel, he says it in the present tense, I rejected him from being king. And so what I believe is that rulers can lose that legitimacy where they're not fit to be a ruler, and they're not fit for that office. That's why people resign. That's why people kick people out of office, and they have terms that they're supposed to have, but you kick them out as the people, which we'll get into that as far as what our country is, and the fact that you would throw them out as being a ruler because they're not legitimate, because they're not ruling, they're not a legitimate ruler, they're not ruling with righteousness. So Hosea chapter 8. Now this is a good one to see. Hosea chapter 8. So right after Daniel, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea. It's the first book of the minor prophets. Because people want to say, well, God set up Obama. God ordained Obama. We need to love him, pray for him. I'll pray for him, but it's not going to be the prayer that you think that I'm going to pray for. And and same thing with Trump. Okay, for someone to tell me that God has ordained Trump and put Trump in that position, give me a break. Someone that's like an adulterer, he's been married like 3 times, he's got a foul mouth, the guy is a narcissist, and to think that God has ordained him to be our president, it's like God set him up, that's actually what we deserve, obviously, as a country, but that's another thing for another day. But Hosea 8 in verse 4, it says, "They have set up kings, but not by me. They have made princes, and I knew it not. Of their silver and their gold have they made them idols, that they may be cut off." What does God say here? He says, they have set up kings, but not by me. And they have made themselves princes, and I knew it not. Meaning that he had nothing to do with it. So Stalin, guess what? God didn't set him up to be a king. Or to be, the rule, in Russia, right? When he... With all the stuff that was going on there, and all the wicked rulers like Mao Zedong, and other people that have done crazy things in the world. And so God doesn't ordain everybody. He doesn't set up every single king. Now, a good example of this is something we've been studying in Revelation. Go to Revelation chapter 13. Is God going to ordain the Antichrist, the world leader? Because that's what it comes down to, my friends. How far do you take it to say that, okay, I need to obey the government no matter what? Whoever's king, whoever's president, and by the way, we don't live in a monarchy here in America. Last time I checked, it's not a dictatorship, it's a republic. And that's what we're going to get into next. But notice in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 2. And these people would, I guess they'll take it as far as saying that we need to obey the beast. Obey the Antichrist. And so, in verse 2 of chapter 13, it says, "And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority." Who's given him his power and his seat of authority? The devil. Remember, the dragon is the devil, the serpent, Satan. And so, the devil is the one that's setting up the Antichrist, which is a man, by the way. So the Antichrist is a literal guy that's going to be in a position of power, and he's eventually going to be the ruler of all the world. 10 kings are going to be giving them, giving him all the power of the whole world, and there's going to be a one world government where he's the head of that. And who gave him that power? Who gave him that authority? Now, the Christians out there that don't read their Bibles, or Christians that would just look at Romans 13 and say, well, we need to obey the government no matter what, would say, well, I guess we should obey him. We should just do what he says because God's telling us to. That's ridiculous. It's not scriptural. And so what you got to look at is, okay, there's the higher powers, and the powers that be are ordained of God, meaning government itself is ordained of God. And so why is this important for him to get across? Because there are anarchists out there that think that there's no need for any government at all. Okay? Now, I'm libertarian in the fact that I want government pretty much out of everything. But there is a role for government. There is something the government is supposed to be doing. And so, but note the highest power. What's the highest power? God and his laws. Now, in our land, in our country, what's the highest power? What's below that? What's the highest law of the land in our country? The Constitution. Doesn't every single governor, president, everybody, they swear with the Bible saying they're going to uphold the Constitution, meaning that they have to follow the Constitution. Their authority is back to the Constitution. What's the Constitution say? We the people. And we the people is a republic built on laws. See, we're not a democracy, which what a lot of people want to say. We're a republic. The only democracy that we have is the fact that we vote in people to fill positions, okay? But our country is built on a republic, which is not a democracy. It's built on laws that are written, and basically you'd have to amend to get rid of them. And so we have the highest law of the land is the Constitution. So against any federal or state law, the Constitution, you cannot go against the Constitution. So this whole thing about, basically you can't carry a gun in a certain state is against the Constitution. Therefore, those laws are legitimate. Now, am I saying to go into California and start toting around a gun? I'm obviously, just because you could try to fight the man all you want, and that's what we're going to get into is the fact that we want to try to live peaceably with all men as much as possible. And obviously they're wrong. Obviously they are, sorry. Whew. I don't know if I swallowed a bug or what. Hopefully I'm not getting the bug that everybody else is getting. Obviously, they are going against the Constitution. They are the ones that are breaking the law. They are the ones that are sinning by saying you can't do something that the Constitution allows. So go back to Romans chapter 13. So first of all, we're not a monarch. So we're not saying, now if we were a monarch, where we had a king, a dictator, okay, then basically you need to do what the king says as long as it doesn't go against the Bible. Does that make sense? And that sucks, okay? But I'm just saying, if you were in a kingdom, now you could just leave the kingdom and go somewhere else, right? But if you were in a country that was a monarch and they had laws and basically they have a king that says, okay, you got to do this, this, and this, wipe my feet or whatever, unless you just want to leave the country or something like that, then yeah, you need to do what the king says as long as it doesn't go against the Bible, okay? But we don't live in that aspect, okay? So that's the extreme measure there, where you're honoring the king and doing whatever the king tells you to do as long as it's not against the Bible. Okay, that's what a lot of people that were in captivity had to do, throughout the Bible. But in Romans 13, verse 3, notice this. And this is what it really comes down to, is that the power of the government to execute judgment upon evildoers, that's ordained by God. But the rulers themselves, they have to be legitimate, okay? And this is what makes them legitimate. Notice in verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Notice, now, here's the thing. If a ruler is a terror to good works, is that really a ruler according to God? Is that a legitimate authority figure? Is that a legitimate governor if they're a terror to good works? It says, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. That tells me that if a ruler is a terror to good works, they're not legitimate in the sight of God, and therefore, obviously, if they're a terror to good works and you're trying to do good, which the Bible commands, then you're not to follow that ruler. Does that make sense? And so we're going to get into that with the fact of what did our country do when we had an oppressive monarch that was taking away our rights, and what did we say about that? So, but what is their job? Okay, so it says, wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. Now let's say we're living in this utopia that the rulers always do right, and they're always doing. Let's say we're living in, they're following the Bible, they're doing exactly what's just and right. Then yeah, if you do good, then you shouldn't worry about anything. It's only if you do evil, because that's what their job is to punish evildoers. Okay. But in reality, obviously, not every ruler is going to be just. Not every ruler is going to do what's right. For he is a minister of God to thee for good, it says in verse 4. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Notice to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. What's the job of the government? Execution. Obviously, execution. the job of the government is basically to punish evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. And so, but the main job for the government is that if someone commits murder, they're to be judged for the crime and they're to be punished accordingly. If someone commits theft, they're supposed to be judged for the crime and punished accordingly. Now, our justice system they just put you in a cage somewhere. But in the Bible, if you were a murderer under 2 or 3 witnesses, you were to be put to death. And we'll get into that in a minute. And then if you committed theft, you had to pay restitution. What happens now? You commit theft, then you pay the state, and the person that was stolen from gets nothing. And then they go to jail, which is not, what the Bible teaches anyway. Sometimes they would take a beating. They would take lashes. And here's the thing. Would you rather take lashes that would only last a moment, or spend 5 years, 10 years in prison, your whole life's ruined? If you had children and a wife, they're probably gone by the time you get out. And so our justice system is not what the Bible teaches at all. But notice, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. That has to be true. What that means to me is that if a ruler is a terror to good works, they're not a legitimate ruler. They're not ordained by God. Now, rulers that are a terror to good works have the power to execute judgment by God. And so, think about it. I mean, do you think God ordains the execution of an innocent person? Is that how far someone would take this, to say God ordains that you executed an innocent person? Obviously, with Jesus, he said it was sin. So they weren't legit. Pilate was not legitimate in what he was doing there. Therefore, it was sin what he did. God did not ordain that. God does not ordain sin. But a parallel passage to this says pretty much the same thing. In 1 Peter chapter 2, so I'm not saying to just go out and be like, I'm not following any law unless it's in the Constitution or unless the Bible states it, okay? Because obviously there's things that are going to be laws and states and stuff like that. We need to try to follow them the best we can, and even if it's dumb. And if it's not going against the Bible, okay? If it's not, causing you to sin. But 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13, it says, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. So this is a strong statement. Whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. Notice the same exact thing that Romans is talking about. What are the rulers and governors and the king supposed to be doing? They're supposed to be punishing evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. Does it say that they are supposed to give us health care? Does it say that they're supposed to regulate our schools and do all this other garbage? You know what? The Constitution doesn't say that either. You know what the Constitution says their job is defend our country nationally and to protect our rights. That's the job of the government, okay? State-wise, what's the job of the government? To punish crime. When you think of like capital punishments, always at a state level, okay? So that's what government's supposed to be doing, is the punishment of evildoers. So forgive me if I don't respect our government when they don't do any of it. When the only thing that they do is take our money and punish people that are doing things that are good. When babies are being killed on the masses today, no one cares about that. When everything that flies in the face of justice in the Bible, they're not punishing evildoers. People are they'll molest a child and then they'll just let them go. They'll rape somebody, they'll just let them go. They'll murder somebody, they'll just let them go. And I've known people that I went to school with that murdered somebody and they just let them out in like months, not even a year. And so it's an injustice system that we have. But God has ordained our government in order to do that. Remember, whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And that's where the anarchists come in and say, well, the government should never, capital punishment, any punishment like that. The thing is, if you don't have punishment for murder and all that stuff, all you're going to have is just rampant sin going out everywhere else. Okay, so the government's supposed to be putting that in check. Public executions for people that commit murder, rape, And it even says that they'll see that in fear. Meaning that if you see someone get publicly executed for pedophilia, those little pedophiles would go hide in their little corner somewhere. And so, which they should just go kill themselves and do us all a favor, first of all. But anyway, the Bible says in Isaiah 32 and verse 1, it says, "Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness, and princes shall rule in judgment." So God commands that that's what they do. Saul didn't do it. What did he do? He removed him from being king. So there's the physical to represent, and God does that throughout history, where he'll set kings up and then he'll tear them down because they don't do what they're supposed to be doing. And so, but think about our own country. So here's the thing. Most Baptist churches will tell you, well, you just need to do what the government says. If the police pulls you over and he wants to search your car, let him do it. You know, you don't have anything to hide, do you? Well, maybe my rights, maybe the fact that I have God-given rights, that they have no right to just search whatever I have. Not to mention it's in the Constitution, in the Fourth Amendment, that they don't have a right unless they have a warrant to search. You know, that's what started the war. Was not only guns, but the main thing was the unlawful search and seizures that were going on, where they would just search all their stuff and take all their stuff. And the taxation without representation obviously was a big deal too. But that was a big one, the Fourth Amendment. And so that was what we went into the Revolutionary War. I want to read a little bit of the Declaration of Independence, because these Baptist pastors that say, well, you just need to do whatever they say, just say yes, sir. If they say if a cop comes up to you and says, wash my car, slave, you better do it. Now, first of all, they're public servants. They are our servants, okay? And unless I'm doing evil, they have no right to tell me to do anything, okay? And so, but anyway, I digress from that. So the Declaration of Independence, now this is a very famous portion of it too. Now obviously you can't turn to it because you've got a Bible in front of you. And this isn't scripture, okay? I'm not saying that the document here I'm reading right now is like inspired scripture, but it's interesting because it does line up with biblical principles, okay? So it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." So notice, they realize they're saying that governments are necessary to conserve the rights, right? And by the consent of the governed. And it says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So notice, why did they make war? Because the government was destructive to the very thing that we're reading in Romans 13. They were a terror to good works and not to the evil. They were ripping their rights away from them, and so they separated from that government and said, we're going to institute a new government that's going to do righteously. Okay? And so I don't believe that our founding fathers were in deep sin for rebelling against the crown. Because, the Bible is very clear that you don't have to follow the government if it's going against Bible. And so where these Baptist pastors get up and take their American flag down, now hopefully they take down their Star Remphan, their God, the gods of the Jews. But they always have that American flag, America, they're all about America and our troops and all this stuff. And they want to preach hard about America, but why don't you preach about the fact that they actually disobeyed the king and went to war against the king? That's what our country wouldn't be here if they didn't do that. And so we celebrate the 4th of July, which is the Declaration of Independence when it was signed. And so, that doesn't make it, I'm not saying that confirms that what they did was right, but it does follow biblical principles that, for For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. And that's what that government was. They were a terror to good works. Therefore, God didn't ordain that. It's not like they were going against the ordained power of some ruler that's a terror against. It's like saying, if you lived in Russia when Stalin was in there and you were going against Stalin, that you're wicked. Okay, so, and so that's just a side note with what our founding fathers did. But I want to give you some examples about this. Now, there's a lot, but go to Daniel chapter 3 about God's people resisting the government. So this is the famous story with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So Daniel chapter 3, and we won't read the whole story, but you know the story, right? Where Nebuchadnezzar has this image made, and basically he says that when they play the flute, the psaltery, the sackbut, all these different instruments, that everybody is to bow down to this image. And these three don't. And so they're thrown into the fiery furnace. But I wanted you to just key in on just what the conversation was between Nebuchadnezzar and these three before they're thrown into the fiery furnace. So in verse 16, so Daniel 3:16, I'll read, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. Now, they're up against the king of kings there, because Nebuchadnezzar is a world king right here. This is a world empire. And it even says, Daniel says, you're a king of kings, because he's a king over a lot of other kingdoms and kings that are ruling over those. And so he's up against the highest power that was in the world that day. And they said, we are not careful to answer you in this manner. What does that mean? Meaning, we don't have to think about how we're going to answer this. And it's really more so, I'm not going to be political on how I answer this. Isn't that exactly how politicians are very careful on how they answer questions and make sure that they can try to say it in such a way that appeals to both sides? They're basically saying, we're not careful how to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So they refused the commandment of the king, and God obviously thought it was righteous because he saved them out of that burning fiery furnace, and because of this, God's name was broadcast throughout the whole world at that time. When they came out, at the end of the story, he basically noises it abroad that no one ever speak against, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so great things came out of this, but obviously that took boldness for them to do that. But that was the right thing to do. So when it comes to standing up for God's word, when it comes to, the government tells you to do something that the Bible is against, you don't have to be careful on how you answer that. If the President of the United States came in here today, think about the extremes. They say, I want you to go kill your neighbor. Think of an extreme example. The President of the United States tells you to do that, then I'm to disobey him. I'd be like, I'm not going to be careful on how I answer you in this matter. I'm not doing it. And so you can go against the government, and you can go against those authorities, obviously, when it goes against the Bible. And so obviously worshiping an idol is against the Bible. Go to Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5, so we'll see in the New Testament the same thing. But you can think of this with Elijah, where he went against the king of Israel, Ahab, and he killed all the prophets. Elijah the prophet killed all the prophets of the queen. Okay? Talking about taking authority into his hands, he executed judgment on all the prophets of Baal, which were 450? Something like that. And 400 of them actually sat at Jezebel's table, so she was angry about that, obviously. So Acts chapter 5, and I don't have time to go into all the different places. Think of all the things where it says, prophesy against this nation, prophesy against this king. And everybody wants to say, you can't say anything evil about the king. You can't say anything evil about the government. You can't say anything evil about the president. Well, the Bible's very clear, pray thou not for this people, for their good in a lot of places. And it also talks about, let his days be few and another man take his office. That's Psalms. So, but Acts chapter 5 and verse 27, it says, and when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did not we straitly command you that you should not teach in this name? And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. It's interesting they say that when they said, let his blood be upon us and upon our children, when they crucified him. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than man. And then they ripped their face off about how they killed Jesus. So here we had the apostles basically saying, I don't care what you commanded us to do. We're doing what God told us to do. So you got to think about this too. It's not just the fact that they're preaching in the temple. They're preaching in the nation, and they're preaching in like places that they would consider government property, right? And so they were civil disobedience. That's what we'd call this, is civil disobedience. And so that's sometimes what we have to do. Now, I want to talk about this revenger, the revenger of blood, or how, it says here in verse 4 of Romans 13. It says, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. There's this thing called in the Old Testament, the revenger of blood. And so what's interesting about how God's law is set up and how his government was set up, they'd have judges. And I'm struggling tonight. Good night. All right, so they had judges that would judge the law. Now they had God's law. So we have three branches in government, right? We have the legislation branch, we have the judicial branch, and then we have the executive branch. So the legislative branch is who makes the laws. Now, who's the lawgiver? God. Okay, so when you think about God's government, the law's already there. No one's making laws. Okay, so the legislative branch is out the window. Okay, now we have judges, so there's your judicial branch. But who's the executive branch? The people. That's what you don't have the police, and you don't have like all these a president or something like. But the king would be like that, right? When they had a king, that would be the executive branch, so to speak, because he's fighting their battles for them and executing judgment. But you'd have judges that would judge the law. They would have this matter come to them. They would judge it according to the law and make a decision. Because not everything was just clear, black and white, this is what it is. So they'd have liberty to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Okay. So, but to go to Numbers chapter 35, and particularly I want you to see about putting people to death, because it says that he beareth not the sword in vain in Romans 13. So that's talking about capital punishment. And it talks about the revenger of all such. And that always pops into my mind when I hear this, of the revenger of blood. And so Numbers chapter 35, and obviously you could read these passages and get more what's going on, and you can even look up the revenger of blood too and just see what it's talking about. But it says in verse 18, so Numbers 35 verse 18, it says, or if he smite him with an hand weapon of wood, wherewith he may die, and he die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. Now, before this, it gives a lot of other examples of how someone would kill somebody, okay? And what's interesting is that there's a difference between first-degree murder and manslaughter. Because first-degree murder is premeditated. You meant to kill that person. Manslaughter is if you accidentally kill somebody. And it talks about that. It says if you were, chopping up wood and the axe head fall off the hilt, and it hit your neighbor on the head that he die, then you need to flee into the city of refuge. So there's these cities of refuge, and it says the revenger of blood is not allowed to kill you there. But if you escape from that, if you leave that city, then if he kills you, then there's no blood on his hand. It's interesting. It's an interesting law. But remember, the law of the Lord is perfect. And so this is the perfect way to deal with these matters. So obviously they wouldn't just put someone to death if it was an accident. But in the case where it wasn't an accident and they meant to do it, that's where it's saying they're to be put to death. And it also states that under only case to put someone to death is under 2 or 3 witnesses. Not under like some kind of forensic analysis, not under, some dogs told me something, like they found something or whatever. You know what I mean? There's like a lot of these things where they put people to death. It's under 2 or 3 witnesses. Okay, it's not just like, well, this person, we think he did kill him. Okay, so it had to be 2 or 3 witnesses. In verse 19 it says, the revenger of blood himself shall slay the murderer. When he meeteth him, he shall slay him. Notice, it's not like there's this guy, this executioner that's given the title, revenger of blood, that has a hood over his head and he just kills all these people, like they would do in most, like medieval times. You'd have the executioner come up with his axe. No, the revenger of blood is the person that wants to kill him because, let's say it was like you killed someone's son, or you killed someone's husband, or brother, or something like that. The revenger of blood is the person that wants to take vengeance on them. Okay? Why else would they have to flee to a city of refuge, and if they left the city, the revenger of blood may kill them? It's like that executioner that you hired in the government is just that bloodthirsty that he's just waiting for someone to leave. No, it's the fact that that person wants them to die. And even if it was an accident, they may still want them to die. Okay? So the revenger of blood himself, meaning the person himself. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 13. And we'll see this again. And this is important too, because if you're going to put someone to death, a lot of times these judges, they'll put someone in prison for 15 years and then they never see them again. They don't see how their life's ruined. They're not there watching them as they get punished. There's injustice in that. The person that is accusing and putting out the sentence of death needs to be in on the execution. Okay? And so that's what it's kind of talking about here in Deuteronomy 13. Start there in verse 6 just to get context of what's going on. It says, if thy brother, the son of thy mother, or the son of thy daughter, or the wife of thy bosom, or thy friend, which is as thine own soul, entice thee secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which thou hast not known, thou nor thy fathers, namely of the gods of the people which are around about you, nigh unto thee, or far off from thee, from the one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth, thou shalt not consent unto him, nor hearken unto him, neither shall thine eye pity him, neither shalt thou spare, neither shalt thou conceal him. Now notice what it says here. But thou shalt surely kill him. Thine hand shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. Notice, the person that saw him do this, and the person that, basically saw this person that was going after other gods, that was committing idolatry, he was to be the first person to put his hand upon this person to put him to death. And then all the people. So if you were to accuse somebody, this would be an example of this. Let's say someone committed murder and you were an eyewitness. That means that you are one of the first people to put that person to death. Right? And back in this day, they would stone him with stones. It says in verse 10, and thou shalt stone him with stones, that he die, because he hath sought to thrust thee away from the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. And then it also talks about in this chapter about the sons of Belial. Okay, so, but we're not getting into that tonight. But basically, the execution was by the revenger of blood, or by the person that's accusing them, the person that saw them do something like this. Okay, now obviously we're not living in a land where if someone commits idolatry and worships another god, that they'll be put to death. That's just not the law of the land. But if we had a righteous government, you'd have the law where it says if you commit murder and it was premeditated and it wasn't an accident, and you have 2 or 3 witnesses, let's say you have 2 witnesses of this act that happened, the witnesses themselves would be the first to put their hand upon them, to put them to death, and then all the people. All the people were involved in this. Okay, so that's interesting. It's interesting that that's the case, but God ordains this. Does that make sense? God ordains that power to do this. And that's where the anarchists are wrong. I'm a minimalist when it comes to government, but I'm not a complete anarchist where I don't think we need any government. There is a need for government. And so that's what it is. It's to execute judgment upon evildoers. And so in the perfect law and the way he had it set up, God was the one that fought their battles. Now in the Constitution, what's the federal government for? To fight our battles. Okay? But in the perfect law of liberty, and especially when Christ is going to rule and reign for 1,000 years, he's fighting our battles. Now that's a benevolent monarchy. Now that's what we're going to have for all eternity, is a benevolent monarchy, because Christ is going to be our king, and then he's going to give the kingdom up to the Father, and that's going to be a benevolent monarchy for all time. And he'll be the King of Kings because we are kings and priests unto God. But that doesn't work. It doesn't work that way when you have a sinful world. Does that make sense? That's why God didn't want them to have a king. Because power corrupts, and you put power on one person, it will always crumble. And so that's why he had judges. He had the law that he set up, and he would be the king. He would be the Lord. But you know, that's why our system of government is one of the best that's ever been set up in America, because it spreads that power out, and you had the balancing of powers. Because they knew that government ultimately was a necessary evil, so to speak, because people are corrupt, people are sinners, and you try to balance that out to try to keep it from getting corrupt. But ultimately, you know, a republic and a nation of laws is only as righteous as the people that make them and the people that are in it. So you get a corrupt nation, it won't matter what kind of laws you have on the books. Okay, so, but I want to get into the next part here. So Romans chapter 13, verse 5. So hopefully all that makes sense with the powers that be are ordained of God. It's talking about the fact that he ordains government to execute judgment upon evildoers, but it doesn't mean he ordains every single person that's in government. So that's where the false versions get it wrong. But in verse 5 there, this isn't going to be, you're not going to probably like this one, okay, but it says, this is where we get into taxes. It says, wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So what this is talking about is the fact that these people that are in positions of governing authorities, they need to be paid. That's what it's saying. It's just as much as the pastor of the church is worthy to live of the gospel and worthy to be paid for the work that he does, the governing officials are to be paid. Does that make sense? And so, obviously, we're talking about the fact that they should be doing what they're doing, right? They should be, and if they're not doing what they're doing, then they shouldn't be paid. They should be thrown out of office. And they shouldn't be in that position. But if they're in the position and they're executing judgment, they're doing what they should be doing, then obviously they need to be paid, and they need to. How do you do that? Through tribute, through offer. You know, that there has to be a way to pay them. And so, but what's interesting about this is Jesus does talk about taxation, talks about tribute. Now we know the famous passage where someone brings a coin to him and says, "Should we pay tribute to Caesar?" Now, tribute and taxes, they're the same thing, but you know, you think of all the different ways you can say it. But remember, he said, show me a penny, and whose superscription's on here? It's Caesar's. He says, render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and the things that are God's unto God. And so he's tricking them, right? Because obviously all things are God. It's God's, right? But he's making a point with that. But notice in Matthew 17, so here's another passage where we're dealing with taxation, and we'll see Jesus' thoughts on it. So I think this is if you want to know how I feel about taxes, this is how I feel about taxes and how I deal with taxes. Because I pay my taxes, okay? I'm just going to be up front with you. I pay my taxes. I don't want to go to jail for tax fraud or something like that. But let's see how Jesus dealt with this, because this actually gets brought up to him when he's with Peter. So Matthew 17, verse 24. By reason, when they were come to Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, doth not your master pay tribute? He saith, yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, what thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children, or of strangers? That is what Peter says. Peter saith unto him, of strangers. Jesus saith unto him, then are the children free. Now this is a strong statement right here. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go thou to the sea, and cast an hook, and take up the fish that first cometh up. And when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. That take and give unto them for me and thee. So Jesus paid tribute. Now, does Jesus agree with it? No. Notice what he says here. Who do you take tribute from? The strangers of a country, or their children, or the citizens? And Peter says strangers. And so, notice what Jesus says, then are the children free. You know what that tells me? That if we're paying taxes, we're not free. Taxation is theft, my friends. And the whole idea of us paying taxes is the fact that we're not free. Now, Jesus says, lest we should offend them, let's pay them. And that's the way I look at it. I don't agree with it. I don't like it that they steal my money away from me, because they're just taking my money and using it for things that are not related to keeping evildoers at bay by any stretch of the imagination. But I don't like it. But unless I offend them, the word they put me in prison for not paying it, then I'm paying it. So how did Jesus deal with taxes? Did he say, nuts to them, nuts to the taxpayer, I'm done, I'm not paying any taxes? No, he paid it when they asked for it, but did he agree with it? Did he think it was right? No. And that's the key. Just because you have to grit through it sometimes, my friends. And notice it says that the children are free. So that tells me that our country isn't free when we're getting taxed about 50% of our income. And when you die, they take another 50% off of whatever you have to give to your children. That's not freedom. And even when the Egyptians had Israel in hard bondage, they took a fifth of what they had and considered that bondage. Now, what's a fifth? 20%. Man, that would be nice to have 20%, right? Wouldn't that be nice that they only took 20% of your income? And so they were in bondage, according to the Bible, under a fifth, when they took a fifth of what they had. And so just a little idea of thinking about where we're at in our country. But Jesus paid it. Now, notice it says, they take it of strangers. What you have to get in your mindset is that this isn't our home. I am not a citizen. I don't look at myself as a citizen of America. I think of myself as a citizen of the New Jerusalem, of Israel. And that's what it says in Ephesians chapter 4. But notice what it says in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13. So an easy way to just let it go when it comes to how they just kill us with taxes and just take all our money is the fact that this isn't our home. This is not what we're striving for. Let their money perish with them. When they keep raising the taxes and taking all my money, let it perish with them, because I've never seen the righteous beg bread. And so God will take care of me. If they tax me so much that my tithe from my gross income and I have nothing left, I believe at the bottom of my heart that God will give me enough to survive, that God will make up the difference, because they can take all the money they want, but you know what? My Lord is the one that owns cattle on 1,000 hills. And so, my idea with taxes is let them have it. Let their money perish with them, and use it all deceitfully, because their end is to be burned. And so they can have their paper monopoly money all they want. And so, but you got to get into that mindset to not care about it. Okay, don't get all frustrated. I mean, I know I have, but just try to let it go and just realize, hey, we're looking for something better than this. We're going to be kings and priests. We're kings and priests spiritually right now, but we will be ruling and reigning with Christ for 1,000 years and then for all eternity, and we won't have to deal with these stupid taxes and them taking all our income anymore. So we just have to deal with it for this little bit of time. So, but notice Hebrews 11 and verse 13. It says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. That's what you got to remember. Keep thinking about that. Yes, they take tribute and taxes as strangers. Well, I consider myself a stranger, so, whatever. Tax me. And so, But the Lord will take care of us while we're here on this earth. And just remember, everything that we own, it's going to be dissolved. We're going through Revelation, and eventually it's not going to be all burned up. So all this stuff, it burns you up. I know it burns me up. Property tax, all this stuff they tax you for. You don't really ever own anything. But you know what? It doesn't matter in the end. All that doesn't matter because it's all going to be burned up in the end. And God's going to give us an inheritance that fadeth not away, where moth and rust does not corrupt. And so just keep that in mind when you're dealing with taxes. So my advice, pay your taxes, okay? Pay your taxes, pay your dues. Just, if at all possible, live peaceably with all men. Try to just, do what you have to do to stay out of prison. Now, if you go to prison for preaching the gospel, amen, I'm for it. That's something I'm worth going to prison. I would go to prison for that. But I do not want to go to prison for some stupid thing like not paying taxes and trying to fight the government. That's not my goal in life. My goal in life is to win as many people to Christ as I can, to follow this book, do what I can until I die, because all this stuff in the world is meaningless anyway. So let's keep going here. So I know you don't like it that I'm saying to pay your taxes, but Jesus did it, and he didn't like it. He didn't think that it was what they should have to do, but it is what it is. And if they pass laws to get rid of taxes, I'd be all for it, obviously. But that's not my fight. That's not my battle. So Romans 13, verse 8. And so the last part here is that was the main part I wanted to get across there, because that's the big crux of the issues with this chapter. So I just want to kind of go through the rest of this chapter and talk about the last portion here. And so hopefully all that makes sense. If you have any other questions on that, let me know. But it's pretty simple when you just think about it and compare Scripture with Scripture when it comes to the powers that be. But Romans 13, verse 8, it says, "Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law." So this is something that's repeated over and over again. But notice, why is love the fulfilling of the law? Well, if you kill your neighbor, do you love them? If you commit adultery against your neighbor, do you love them? If you steal something from your neighbor, do you love them? And so if you love them, you're not going to do any of that. Does that make sense? So it's basically making it very simple for us to understand. Love God and keep his commandments, right? That's the whole duty of man. And if you do that, you're fulfilling the two greatest commandments, which is the whole of the law and the prophets is hinged on this. Love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might, and love thy neighbor as thyself. Because if you do that, you won't break any of those commandments. Does that make sense? But it says that it's the fulfilling of the law. Go to Galatians chapter 5, and there's a couple places where it really it says this, and so I just want to show you that. But Galatians 5 and verse 13, Galatians 5 verse 13, it says, "For brethren, ye have been called unto liberty, only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." So here we see it again, that all the law is fulfilled in this, just love thy neighbor as thyself. James 2 in verse 8, James 2 in verse 8. So James 2 verse 8 says, "If ye fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, ye do well. But if ye have respect to persons, ye commit sin and are convinced that the law is transgressors." So the royal law is to love thy neighbor as thyself. The fulfilling of the law is all about loving thy neighbor as thyself. And so how do we love our neighbor? Keep God's commandments. How do we love God? Keep God's commandments. It's pretty simple. Okay, if you want to fulfill the law, you love your neighbor. So you see how that works back and forth? You say, well, how do I love somebody? Well, keep God's commandments. How do I keep his commandments? Well, love your neighbor. So it works back and forth, and if you don't, simply just do what God tells you to do, and by the fact that is the fulfilling the law, then you're going to love your neighbor. You're going to love God. And so go to 2 John chapter 1. And this is something that it talks about a lot in John and in 1 John and 2 John. But, a lot of people are like, oh, I love God. They're always talking about, oh, my love for God is so deep. Do you go to church? No. Do you do this? Do you drink? All these different things. Do you lie? Do you steal? All these different things. It's like, well, you can't say you love God when you don't keep His commandments. And so all this idea of like, oh, I love God, but I don't go soul winning. Oh, I love God, but I don't read His Word, which we're commanded to read. And so this whole idea of like this artificial love for God. And so 2 John verse 5, 2 John verse 5, it says, "And now I beseech thee, lady, not as though I wrote a new commandment unto thee, but that which we had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk after His commandments." This is the commandment, that as ye have heard from the beginning, you should walk in it. So what's love? That we keep His commandments, that we walk in His commandments. And Jesus says in John 14:15, it says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." So you can't say that you love Jesus. Now, we love Him because He first loved us, right? That's the most important thing, is that He loves us. And just as much as that we're known of Him, and we try to know God, right? But being known of Him is the more important thing. But if you want to say that you love Jesus, you better be keeping His commandments. Because if you don't keep His commandments, you don't love Christ. And so, but in John chapter 13, go to John chapter 13, and I just want to talk about that because in 1 John and 2 John, you'll see this phrase, or basically they're saying, "A new commandment I write unto you, which thing is in you." And it says, "I write no new commandment unto you, but that which you have heard from the beginning. A new commandment I write unto you, which thing is true in Him and in you, because the darkness is past and true light now shines." So He's saying, like, I'm not writing a new commandment unto you, but a new commandment I write unto you, right, in 1 John. You're like, what in the world is he talking about? So this is kind of just a side note. But then we saw here, I write, not as though I write a new commandment unto you. So what's this new commandment? Why are they saying, I'm not really writing you a new commandment, but here's a new commandment? Well, this really answers this, if you ever kind of wondered what they were talking about there. But John 13, verse 34, now Jesus is talking. He says, "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another, as I have loved you, that ye also love one another." Notice, that's what's new about it, is the fact that we're loving others, we're loving our brethren as He loved us. Okay, because Christ came to die on the cross for us. That's why it's new, but it's not, because from the beginning He's told us to love one another. Okay, so the new aspect is the fact that we're loving Him like He did, which He died for us. Remember, hereby perceive we the love of God, because He laid down His life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. There's the new commandment, so to speak, that we're going to love Him as Christ did, which meaning we would lay down our lives for the brethren. Does that make sense? And it says, and this will really help you understand 1 John, verse 35. "By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another." Isn't that something that 1 John keeps saying? If you don't love your brother and all this stuff, it's talking about being a disciple. And remember, we talked about the sons of God, the manifestation of the sons of God. If you're walking in the Spirit, you are a disciple. If you're walking in the Spirit, you're walking as a child of God. But if you're walking in the flesh, you're not walking as a child of God, because your flesh is still unregenerated. Okay, so that one's kind of a side note with the new commandment. Eventually, we'll do a whole series on the 1 John and go through all that, because there's definitely some difficult passages in there. But let's end the chapter here. It says in Romans 13, verse 11. So we'll end off the chapter here. It says, and this is one of my favorite verses as far as just something to think about, these two verses here. In verse 11 it says, "And that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. For now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envy envying, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. Basically what this is saying is like, it's time to get serious about the things of God. It's time to put off all the garbage, to put off the old man, and get serious about things of God, because the day is at hand. Now what it's saying when it says that, it's talking about the time is at hand. Remember it says in Revelation, the time is at hand. It starts off Revelation with saying that, and then ends Revelation with saying that, because the Lord is at hand. You know, we're talking about the time of when the Great Tribulation is going to be taking place, and we're going to be looking for Christ in the clouds after the sun and moon are darkened. That's what we've been talking about throughout the Sunday evenings. But our salvation is nearer than when we believed. Now, it's talking about salvation. Think about that. What are we waiting for? The redemption, to wit, or it says the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. It says in Romans chapter 11. So what are we waiting for? That redemption. And redemption is just another word for salvation. So it's not talking about, our salvation meaning like we're going to get saved, and go to heaven. But technically that would be the case. If Christ came in the clouds, we'd be with him in the clouds, but physically and spiritually. And so it's saying that it's nearer than when we believed. So that's what you got to keep thinking in your mind. It's like, it's time. You want to say, well, when should I get serious about reading the Bible? Now. Get ready now. It's nearer than when you believed. The night is far spent. We need to live in the day, just as much as it says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, how we're to be the children of the day and not of the night. We're supposed to be sober. We're supposed to watch. We need to be ready. We need to get serious about the things of God right now. And, go to now, the Bible says. Go to now. You want to know when to do something? Do it now. You say, well, I feel like, man, I feel like reading the Bible a lot. Do it now. I've got this real desire to memorize the Bible. Do it now. Do it right now when you have the desire. Now's the time to do it. Don't wait. Don't wait and say, well, I'm young. I got time. You never know, first of all, how long you have to live. But second of all, we don't know how long it's going to be until that end time comes. That could happen tomorrow, that all this stuff starts going down. And then, are you ready for that? And so, it's high time to wake out of sleep. We need to be sober. We need to watch. And, just get into the Bible, read it, memorize it. It's time to get serious about the things of God. Romans chapter 13 is a great chapter. Definitely misunderstood. Definitely something that's been twisted to say other things. Other versions have definitely tried to make it say other things. So I'm not against government. The Bible, according to this chapter, this is a great chapter to prove that we need government for something, and that it does have the power to execute capital punishment. That's something that needs to be preached, because there's a lot of people out there that think the government shouldn't do capital punishment. That's actually the reason that it's there. Okay, that's the reason it's supposed to be there. Should we pay taxes? Well, we shouldn't have to. Okay. But, lest we should offend them. And then, we need to be ready, we need to be watching, we need to be sober, because the day of our salvation is nearer than when we believed. So let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for today, and thank you for this evening. And Lord, just pray that you give us safety as we go home. But Lord, we just pray that you'd help us to understand your word. And Lord, help us to apply it. Even if we don't maybe like what it says, Lord, just help us to like it, and help us to love it, and help us to want to be conformed to whatever it says. And Lord, we love you. Pray also in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.